Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say a warm welcome to you all here in the Grand Salon this evening for a pre-dinner conversation. Now, many of you have been with us for many days sailing on board, and you'll notice that we've added to our conversation program over the last few days in our ports of call, and it's my joy to bring to you the next piece of our conversation puzzle. Now, Dori is going to be with us for the next, until Hong Kong, right? So we've got just a brief spell of Dori here for our conversation program. I'm going to be sharing with you a huge wealth of expertise. In actual fact, in Dori's life and career, she's written many books, including not only an autobiography, but also many other topics of conversation for books, including historical references, geographical, some fiction as well. So a very, very interesting set of conversations coming your way, sharing her life and her time that's spent living in China back in the 1980s and throughout the modern years as well. So without further ado, it's now time to welcome up to the podium and give a warm Seabourn welcome. Now, I have to say, just very quickly, she's come over here from the Seabourn Odyssey, and over on the Seabourn Odyssey, Dori was a bit of a rock star over there. So I want a nice round of applause tonight for the fabulous Dori Jones Yang. Thank you so much, Dori.
Thank you, Ross. And thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to see you here. I'm so glad to be here on this sojourn. So I am going to give several talks on understanding China better, because it's easy to misunderstand China, right? And as Ross said, I've written several books, and my latest one is, I was just told the lettering is very hard to read on this, so it's called When the Red Gates Opened, a memoir of China's reawakening. And this is a memoir of my experience as a journalist covering China in the 80s. And I think there's going to be a couple of copies up in the boutique, although the Odyssey people kind of bought out most of them, so we don't have as many as I thought we were going to have. So today, as you can see, I'm going to be discussing Beijing's relations with Hong Kong and Taiwan. Those of you who know more can ask some great questions, I'm sure, at the end. But if you'll indulge me, I would like to start with a story. So this is me when I was 29. I was living in Hong Kong as Business Week's bureau chief in the 80s, and I was dating a Chinese guy named Paul Yang, who is in the front row filming me right now. And one day he suggested we go to see a movie, a made-in-China movie in a movie theater in Hong Kong, and I thought, well, that sounded kind of fun. I hadn't been to a movie theater yet in Hong Kong, and also it was a chance to maybe pick up a few more words of Mandarin. I already spoke it pretty well, but I was always trying to expand my vocabulary. And we got to the movie theater, and early enough to get good seats, and I was surprised. The theater just filled up. Almost every seat was taken, which was mind-boggling for me because this was a 25-year-old film made in mainland China, and it had the most unpromising title, which you cannot read here, I assume, called Lin Zexu. And this was a man that I had never heard of at that moment. And the movie tells the story of the Opium War, but from a Chinese perspective. And from the very earliest scenes, it kind of made me squirm a bit because, as you all know, in the history of Hong Kong, in this movie, it had the evil British merchants eager for profits and insisting on shipping opium, highly addictive drug, into China. And, I'd always kind of admired the British and had read about the opium smugglers as kind of, swashbuckling adventures. I don't know if any of you have ever read Taipan. And at the climax of the movie, the good Chinese official, Mr. Lin, orders the seizure and burning of all the British traders' opium. And of course, the British fight back. And then suddenly I jump in the movie theater because everyone around me is erupted in loud boos when they see the British fighting back. And then you see the patriotic farmers as they roar, as they gather up their pitchforks and attack the British soldiers. And the moviegoers cheer as the frightened foreigners run away like scared dogs. And I'm like scrunching down in my seat, trying to be invisible because sort of half wondering if somebody might I don't know, come after me for looking like the enemy, right? Of course, we left the movie theater safely, but something had shifted inside me. I realized at that moment that the Chinese have a radically different view, different perspective on Hong Kong than I had been taught. And at that time in the 1980s, of course, Hong Kong was a British colony and had been for more than 100 years. And why? Because the British had seized it after that first Opium War and after crushing the Chinese army, which just was not prepared to fight against them, in order to protect the British illegal opium trade. And no Chinese forgot about that humiliation, including my husband. So, I mean, of course, I had known the facts. You probably all know those facts as well. But I had never felt the visceral anger that many Chinese feel when they hear this story. And today, when China's relations with the West are fraught and tense, as you all know, I believe it's important for us in the West to open our minds to understand the Chinese perspective and just to figure out why China's leaders act and speak the way they do. Otherwise, we risk a severe misunderstanding that could, now that China is stronger, lead to war. So today, I hope to show you a point of view you may not have considered before, just as I hadn't back in that movie theater. And my goal is to give kind of an even-handed view on how these issues look from all sides, from the West, from China, and then from the point of view of the local people. And just to broaden our understanding of all these issues that affect Beijing's outlook on both Hong Kong and Taiwan. So as you can see from this map, Hong Kong is in mainland China. I'm sure you all know that. And Taiwan is only 100 miles off its shore. But this map shows the imbalance in power between mainland China, which is huge, and Hong Kong and this island of Taiwan. Hong Kong and Taiwan together have only about 2% of the population of mainland China. But of course, they have an outsized importance to China in terms of trade and technology, especially Taiwan's importance in advanced semiconductor production, which we'll get to in a minute. So let's start with Hong Kong, since we're headed there now. That's our next port of call. So from my personal perspective, I love Hong Kong. I lived and worked there for 8 years. I met my husband there, gave birth to my daughter there, love the food. I'm sure you all love the food too. And recently we spent a week there and caught up with old friends. And it was just great to feel the city's vibrant buzz again. But back home, where I live in Seattle, I hear and read about a kind of a darker view of Hong Kong. So in the US, we read a lot about China's crackdown on pro-democracy protesters in 2019 in Hong Kong, and the arrests of journalists and activists since then. I'm sure you've all read those articles. And frankly, many people that I know and talk to, kind of imagine only monsters in Beijing. But I discovered that there was a lot of misperception among my American friends. And I thought today we'll take a closer look at just the facts of what actually happened and what Beijing actually did at that time. So as it happens, I arrived in Hong Kong as a reporter in June of 1982. And that was just 3 months before the leaders of Britain and China, Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping, began their talks on the future of Hong Kong. And as you can imagine, this was a big story, which I wrote about then and often afterwards. This was my first cover story for Business Week. I was very proud of that. So first, a bit of history, though. How did these talks even start? And why did Britain just hand China back to Hong Kong, or Hong Kong back to China? Britain occupied Hong Kong in 3 steps. In 1842, 1860, and 1898. And each time it was after China had been defeated in a war. And the last and biggest piece in the light blue there was leased to Britain for 99 years. So, I mean, imagine that. You sign a treaty. The people who signed that treaty probably thought that would be like forever, right? If you signed a treaty today for 99 years. But by the 1980s, it was suddenly imminent because that lease was expiring in 1997. So now some context. So what did Hong Kong mean to Britain? So back in 1920, the British Empire was the largest empire in world history. I'm sure you probably know this. And it had, at its peak, it had 23% of the world's population. But by 1982, Hong Kong was an historical anachronism, just a tiny colony for Britain and one of the few that it still had left. Still, it was an important stepping stone for British and American and others to do business in China. So that's how it looked to Britain. How did Hong Kong look to the Chinese? So back at the start of the 1800s, this map shows China at its largest size ever in history. But then as the 1800s went on, the government of China grew weaker and actually more corrupt as well. And it did not have a strong navy. It wasn't used to dealing with foreign powers with strong navies who were fighting to grab territory from it. China had never faced adversaries like that. And then as the 1800s went on, this is a rather complicated map, but all those different colors within the red borders of China then, show that the foreign powers had sort of gobbled up territory of China. So that included Manchuria, Shandong, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and parts of many port cities, including Shanghai. And if they couldn't actually occupy the land as a colony, these European and Japanese militaries were able to get special privileges for their citizens in areas they called spheres of influence, which are in the lighter colors there. And Chinese remember this period with horror as, you probably heard this, the century of humiliation. So the worst humiliation during that century was the destruction and burning of the emperor's elegant summer palace. I don't know if any of you have visited this, the remains of it, when you were in Beijing at some other time. It was not just a palace, but a vast complex of palaces and gardens filled with treasures, and it was built for the enjoyment of the emperor. And in 1860, European soldiers burned it to the ground. Most of them were wooden structures. They're completely gone. There are only a few that were not, that are still remaining. And I recommend that if you don't have a Chinese face, don't watch a movie about this in a Chinese place. This is one of the sorest points in history of China and the West. So why did the talks on Hong Kong's future even start? So as I said, by the 1980s, the British believed their 99-year was due to expire in 15 years, and that uncertainty made it hard for them to plan. Plus, China, frankly, had a lot of leverage. So if it just threw open the border, Hong Kong would have been flooded with migrants. They never threatened to do this, but the British knew that that was possible. And if it shut off the water and food, Hong Kong would have starved. So they didn't have a lot, the British didn't have a lot of leverage. Margaret Thatcher's initial plan was to go to Beijing, sign an agreement, extend the 99-year lease. It sounds rather naive now, doesn't it, when you think about it? But the British thought it was very practical, right? After all, Hong Kong was thriving and capitalist, and it was very useful to mainland China, especially in those days. So how did it look to the Chinese? Well, the Chinese Communist government, which, as you know, took power in 1949, did not recognize any of those treaties as valid, since they were signed under duress. And Beijing had, in fact, gained back almost all that territory you saw there that it had lost to foreign occupation. except Hong Kong and nearby Macau, which was a colony of Portugal, as you probably know. For China's leader, Deng Xiaoping, getting Hong Kong back for China from foreign occupiers would be a major victory that would finally reverse the century of humiliation and cement his place in history. Of course, he has a very good place in history, as we'll talk about the next time. But wait, what about the people of Hong Kong? They're the most important people involved here, right? And their lives are most affected. So how did it look to them? Well, back in 1982, most of Hong Kong's 6 million residents were Chinese, and many of them had fled from communism after 1949. And the heartbeat of their city was business, running factories, trading, real estate. They wanted to get on with their business. And as a Business Week reporter, I interviewed many local Hong Kong entrepreneurs, and this one really sticks in my mind. His name is Dennis Ting, and he made Cabbage Patch dolls. Does anyone here remember Cabbage Patch dolls? And they were very popular. And I asked him, I was talking to him about his business, then I said, well, what do you think of Hong Kong's future? And his response was, who can trust the communists? And frankly, what most Hong Kong people wanted then was what he wanted, which is basically stability and just the chance to get on with life and get on with their business. So what did Thatcher and Deng agree on about Hong Kong's future? The negotiations took 2 full years. Deng insisted that China regain sovereignty over Hong Kong. Thatcher objected at first, but then agreed, as long as there were certain promises that China gave. So Deng offered a framework called One Country, Two Systems, which you know about, promising that Hong Kong would be recognized as part of China for foreign relations and for national defense, but that Hong Kong people could continue with their way of life. And by this, in his mind, their way of life meant they could continue making money under the capitalist system. But let's not forget that at that time, Hong Kong was not a democracy. I think a lot of people kind of think maybe it was, but it was a colony, and it was ruled by a governor appointed by London. Still, freedom of speech and freedom of the press were a way of life. So Deng also promised that Hong Kong would be given a high degree of autonomy for 50 years. So what that meant was that it could manage its own affairs under a government run by local Hong Kong Chinese. And to ensure their agreement, Britain and China agreed to compose and pass a mutually acceptable basic law for Hong Kong, and that's kind of similar to a constitution. And that law included some promises for local elections, but in language that Hong Kong and Beijing Chinese would later interpret very differently. So more important though, the 1980s were a time of hope. So this whole agreement was done in the context of the 80s. Deng was allowing some capitalism to flourish in China, and he was determined to raise living standards. And in that atmosphere, it seemed possible to give Hong Kong back to China without too much disruption. So what happened in 1997? Did everybody freak out? I think you know the answer. No. Britain set off fireworks over Hong Kong. I was very lucky. I went back to Hong Kong. At that point, we were living in Seattle, and I took my little daughter when we went back to witness this, what the British called the handover, and what Beijing called, any guesses? The return. And Prince Charles was there. He read a farewell speech, shook hands with China's president. The Union Jack was lowered, and the flag of China was raised, and both sides seemed fairly pleased. And China waited till the next day to send a very small garrison of soldiers to Hong Kong, but it was very low-key, and they stayed out of the spotlight. So it was a peaceful transition, which, given earlier fears, is actually pretty amazing. So in those first 20 years after the handover, Hong Kong seemed, by and large, pretty stable and prosperous. There were a few British judges who stayed, but as you can see here, most of the judges were Hong Kong Chinese, and also all of the administrative personnel. And Hong Kong still had freedom of speech. We visited many times and saw protesters there, and freedom of the press. And the local legislature did have some elected officials, and debates were very lively. So let's jump ahead 20 years. What went wrong? So in June of 2019, we all saw these pictures, right? Mass protests began. And what set them off? There was a proposed law that would allow extradition of prisoners to China. And at first, the street protests were 100% peaceful. And the biggest one, which is this one, attracted nearly 2 million people, and that was at the time nearly a quarter of the population of Hong Kong. But then, as the protests continued, went on month after month, things deteriorated. And there was looting and firebombs, there was destruction of subway stations. Protesters occupied the international airport. You may have heard about that. Stopped all air travel for one day. And the Hong Kong police tried to stop the protests. They used batons and pepper spray and tear gas, and later live ammunition. But the protests just kept going on, and it was fueled by a wave of support from the West. In a strange foretaste of the storming of the US Capitol, about a year and a half earlier, protesters broke into the Legislative Council building of Hong Kong and vandalized the chamber. And the police made mass arrests. The street scenes were ugly. But throughout the many, many months that this went on, only one protester died after a clash with police. And it's important to remember there was no mass killing. You probably all know that, but I have some friends at home that hear Beijing crackdown, and then they think it must have been mass killing. So here's what we heard in the West. The narrative was very consistent. These were peaceful pro-democracy protests, championing a noble cause. The movement was crushed by brutal police, acting on behalf of Beijing. And of course, the US and British and other governments sided with the protesters and sanctioned several of Hong Kong's leaders. So how did it look to the Chinese? Of course, Beijing denounced the protests, as you would expect, but many ordinary people in China were also appalled, especially when they saw some of these images of Hong Kong Chinese waving British flags or American flags. And to them, it just it's like fingernails on a chalkboard. It was like begging for a return to foreign control, is what it looked like to them. And Chinese soldiers did not intervene. These are actually a few of the Chinese soldiers. One time in those 8 months that they came out of their barracks was just one day, and it was to clear a road of bricks that had been placed there by the protesters to block traffic. And they didn't even wear their uniforms, as you can see here. So they certainly didn't come out with their guns blazing, which is kind of the impression a lot of, at least my friends, had. So more important, how did it look to the people of Hong Kong? The public opinion about the protests were much more divided than what we were reading about in the West, at least where I was. Initially, many people of all ages did join the protests when they were peaceful. But as the protests dragged on and became more violent, many Hong Kong citizens were turned off. And often families were divided. The young people wanted to run out in the street and protest, and their parents were like begging them not to go out. So often it was a generational divide. And many were appalled by the vandalism and the disruption of life week after week after week. So how did it finally end? In early 2020, we all remember what happened. So as soon as the pandemic began, the protests stopped after 8 months. So afterwards, what did Beijing do? Within 6 months, as you know, I'm sure, Beijing passed a national security law for Hong Kong. Actually, Hong Kong was supposed to pass one for itself and had not been able to do it politically, so Beijing did it. And it outlawed 4 crimes: secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign powers. Actually, most countries have laws that outlaw these things. But in effect, what happened is that this new law sharply curtailed freedom of the press and freedom of speech. And only so-called patriotic candidates now, ones who are approved by Beijing, can run for office in elections. And many pro-democracy activists, after this law was passed, many activists and journalists were arrested and put on trial. Some were jailed. And that, of course, caused fear among journalists, academics, teachers, activists. Tens of thousands of Hong Kong people and foreigners living in Hong Kong moved to Western countries. But for most Hong Kong people, just going about their daily lives, life goes on, at least for now. And I think you'll see that when you're there. It kind of looks like the last time you were there, if you were there before. So as you might imagine, this chaos and crackdown reverberated across the water and made lasting changes in Taiwan. So let's move on to Taiwan. First, my personal perspective. I also love Taiwan. My husband grew up there, went to high school and college there, and we often visited his parents, who lived there for 40 years. Last week, we met up with many of Paul's friends and relatives in Taipei. But once again, back home in Seattle, I hear and read about a darker perspective. Americans who have never been to Taiwan casually discuss the likelihood of war. You've probably heard this as well. So as we get ready to sail through the Taiwan Straits, I think you can set your mind at ease. War seems extremely unlikely anytime soon, but it does help to understand what's behind all of the fearful talk. And once again, the West and China have opposite views of Taiwan. So in the West, we hear that China is threatening to start a war, grab Taiwan, demolish its democracy. And some American observers have also been talking rather loosely about the risk of World War III starting over Taiwan. But yet, as you may have seen when you were in Keelung recently, most people in Taiwan are not panicking or freaking out or running for the exits. After all, they've been living in the shadow of mainland China for many decades, and they're used to it. But all of us saw those frightening images of Beijing's war exercises over Taiwan in 2022. So what's really happening? First, just a very brief history of Taiwan. Although Taiwan has a small number of indigenous people, the vast majority of Taiwan's people, about 95 to 97%, are ethnic Chinese. And some of them are even descended from fishermen who moved to Taiwan 400 to 500 years ago. And during the Age of Discovery in the 1600s, European ships landed there in Taiwan. The Dutch had ruled it as a colony for 50 years. China took it back, and it remained under Chinese control for about 300 years. And then in 1895, as you probably know, Japan defeated China in a war and won control of Taiwan. So Taiwan became a colony again, this time under Japan, for another 50 years. And this was very humiliating for China. In 1945, after Japan lost World War II, Taiwan was returned to China, which was then ruled by Chiang Kai-shek. So who did the world see as the rightful rulers of China? So the United States and the UN, as you probably know, refused to recognize Mao's communist government, although Britain did, and which was called the People's Republic of China. And the US continued to recognize Chiang Kai-shek's government's claim on the right to rule all of China. And Chiang Kai-shek still used the name Republic of China, which is still used in Taiwan today, but now he ruled only Taiwan plus a few tiny islands. So in those days, in 49, 50, many in Washington thought the Communist Army would quickly take Taiwan too. But after the Korean War broke out in June of 1950, the US Navy sent its 7th Fleet to Taiwan Straits to prevent the Chinese communists from taking over Taiwan. And because of this, Mao's forces never succeeded in taking it. So until today, as you know, Taiwan has effectively remained independent of Communist China with its own government, still called the Republic of China, and the US strongly supported it until, with 2 mind-boggling visits to Beijing by Kissinger and then Nixon, the US government made a dramatic reversal. It recognized reality that the communist government did in fact rule China, and then in 1979, Washington closed its embassy in Taipei and opened one in Beijing. But in order to seal the deal, Washington had to formally agree with Mao's One China policy, that the Mao's government, the People's Republic of China, is the only legal government of all of China, and to acknowledge Beijing's position that there's one China and Taiwan is part of it. But, and this is a big but, the US managed to have its cake and eat it too, with a policy informally called strategic ambiguity. So technically, the US recognizes Beijing's right to rule Taiwan, but in fact, it sells arms to the government in Taipei. So it's kind of confusing. Clearly, Beijing's leaders are not fooled. They know that the US threatens to respond with force if Beijing attempts to invade Taiwan. So the stakes on both sides are very high. But wait, China's a democracy, right? We hear this a lot too, with free elections. It's absolutely true, but it's interesting to note it's only been a democracy since 1996. That's because when Chiang Kai-shek ruled Taiwan, he ruled as an autocrat under martial law. And in 1987, his son, who was his successor, began a transition to democracy. And by then, living standards had risen, and Taiwan's economy had modernized and industrialized. And to us in the West, this just seemed proof that Asians in many different countries, once their living standards rose, would demand democratic rights. But when Taiwan held its first direct presidential election in 1996, Beijing was furious, as you can imagine. And to show its anger, China conducted, back then, missile tests in the Taiwan Straits. And that prompted the US to send 2 aircraft carriers this time, aircraft carrier battle groups, to the waters near Taiwan. And that was called the Taiwan Straits Crisis. And frankly, most of us today, I don't know about you, but many people have forgotten all about it. But Beijing hasn't. It caused Beijing to embark on a 10-year military modernization program and to buy and build aircraft carriers of its own. So still, since then, Taiwan has kept on holding presidential elections every 4 years. Taiwan has 2 main political parties. The Blue Party favors dialogue with mainland China, and the Green Party champions Taiwanese identity, although they're very careful not to anger Beijing by using that forbidden word, independence. A lot of people don't realize this, but for a while, rapprochement between Taiwan and the mainland seemed actually pretty possible and likely. So starting in the 80s, family visits were allowed. People from Taiwan could go over to China and reconnect with their relatives that they'd been separated from for so many years. Trade increased. Taiwan companies built factories in the mainland. And then, amazingly, in 2015, so this is less than 10 years ago, China's President Xi Jinping, who was pretty new at that time, actually met with Taiwan's then president, who was with the Blue Party, and shook his hand. A lot of people have forgotten about that, too. But then things soured. The very next year, Taiwan's Green Party candidate, Tsai Ing-wen, you may have seen her in her picture, won the presidency of Taiwan. and cross-strait relations between Taiwan and the mainland cooled. And then in 2020, when Hong Kong's protests were at their peak, as you can imagine, many Taiwanese were spooked. And there was another election then, and Tsai easily won re-election in Taiwan. So this year in January, you probably read Taiwan elected a new president. There's a term limits, so Tsai was not able to run again, but her vice president, this man, Lai Ching-te, won. And he's from the Green pro-independence party, as is Tsai. But this election was a lot closer than previous ones. Mr. Lai had two opponents, and so he got actually a smaller percentage of the vote, only about 40% of the vote. They don't have runoffs there. It's whoever wins the most votes. And then also his party lost its majority in the Legislative Assembly. So Mr. Lai, who will actually take office in May, is going to have to compromise in ways that others haven't. But once again, between East and West, there are really sharply different views on Taiwan's situation. In the West, what we see today, and you read about this, is that Taiwan is de facto independent, a threatened democracy, and many US pundits see potential parallels with Ukraine, invaded by Russia in violation of the rules-based international order. But here's a big difference between Taiwan and Ukraine. Unlike Ukraine, Taiwan actually is not recognized as an independent country under those same rules-based international order. So Xi Jinping, the president of China, has repeatedly stated that his aim is peaceful reunification with Taiwan, but he will not rule out use of force. And as you heard before, that's been consistent all the way back to Mao said the same thing. Deng said the same thing many years ago. And they don't want to lose their leverage. So Beijing has offered Taiwan one country, two systems, which isn't very attractive to them because it's a modification of the Hong Kong model, but Taiwan is so different from Hong Kong, as you know. It's unlike Hong Kong, Taiwan is a full-fledged democracy, and it's run by local Chinese, and it has its own army and its foreign policy, none of which Hong Kong had. Still, President Xi Jinping would like to finish the job that Deng Xiaoping started and reunify the nation. So what about the people of Taiwan? According to opinion polls, about 60% of them, no matter what their party, really favor maintaining the status quo, which is a careful balance of de facto independence without declaring the right to independence. And they want to maintain good relations with the US. So according to, so what is the likelihood of the US and China going to war? A lot of people ask this question. It's hard to predict the future, obviously. But what set off the current round of tension is when the US Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, made a formal visit to Taiwan 2 years ago. I'm sure you read about this. And before she went, President Xi warned Biden that those who play with fire will perish by it. Pretty direct, right? And then just after Pelosi left Taiwan, China's Navy and Air Force began their most extensive military exercises ever. For 8 days, missiles flew right over Taiwan into the sea beyond. Chinese warships surrounded the island. Dozens of military jets flew close to Taiwan. And these red areas were where the mainland Chinese ships were active. China wanted to show the world that its Navy and Air Force are strong enough, maybe not necessarily to invade Taiwan, but certainly to surround it and impose a blockade. And Taiwan couldn't survive very long without imports and exports. Which gets us to the Silicon Shield. You've probably heard of this. Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company, TSMC, Taiwan makes more than 60% of the entire world's semiconductors, which is kind of mind-boggling. It's not a very big place, as you know, and roughly 90% of the world's most advanced computer chips. And actually, its biggest customer is China. We think of them as supplying the West, but they also supply China. So some people think this company alone would help deter any kind of Chinese invasion, because an attack on Taiwan would cause a major disruption in the global economy, which is obviously something China does not want. It would be terrible for Taiwan, it would be terrible for China, it would be terrible for every country in the world. So maybe saner minds will prevail because the cost of war is just too high. So President Xi wants Taiwan back, but Beijing can afford to play the long game. And when China gets even stronger and even richer, Taiwan may someday come back into the fold, hopefully peacefully. I realize that's wishful thinking. We don't know how it's going to play out. So my take on Taiwan's future, what I really hope for personally, is a de-escalation of the tension and greater dialogue and the ability to live with the status quo. So the best way, I believe, to maintain peace in the Taiwan Straits is for both Washington and Beijing to tone down the rhetoric. This is just my personal opinion, and to pull back and find somehow, some way to make the status quo acceptable to the other side. Now, I understand why our militaries need to be prepared, but I believe the real solution needs to come through dialogue with mutual respect and understanding. And it seems like that would also be best for the people of Taiwan. So thank you very much. It's already 7, which is dinner time. I love taking questions, but I also realize many of you want to get to dinner. But thank you for listening.